Okay, since I made a mistake in that recording of number 5, I wanted to go ahead and re-record some of this. So I'm going to probably pause and continue just while I'm trying to understand what I was saying in the previous recording and then show you on the screen. So I think where we were was we were trying to move the story progression functionality that currently lives in choice-made IB action into the next story method. So what we were talking about is how if you are calling this function, when you get the actual button click, so the sender UI button choice made is connected to the to these choices. So when you actually get that in this button click, then what's happening is you're calling the method called next story in the story brain and sending in the current title. So the current title that is like you see a fork in the road and so forth. So what we're going to do now is go over to the, let me see, finish this part. And we don't really need this all this code that we figured out before, the choice 1 for normal and so forth. So what we're going to do is basically just say if we're going to create a variable called, or a constant called let current story equal stories story number. And that's why I was showing you how to troubleshoot that in the previous portion. And then what we need to do is find out if the user choice which is this variable right here. So it's the argument that is the that we're choosing to be the name for the thing that's passed in. So the string called "you see a fork in the road" is actually called the user choice. So anyway, if user choice equal 0, I'm sorry, it equals the current story. Choice 1, then we know that we want it to go to choice 2. So see this, I mean, actually it's number 1. So we're just going to set it to story number equal 1. And then we're going to have an else statement. User choice. Oh, here. Let me see. Oh, user choice equal current story dot choice 2. Then we're going to set story number equal to 2. And we don't need any of this other stuff. So let's see what it's complaining about this. Story number. They're talking about the instance. Let's see. Oh yeah, so it wanted it to be mutating because we were actually changing the value within the method. And remember, we call it a method because it's inside the struct. Otherwise, we'd call it a function if it was inside, for example, the view controller. And that's not actually true either, because the methods are in the view controller class. So anyway, so I think this is what we needed to do. And then let's see. Let me pause and see what the next part of that story was. Just a sec. I mean, what the next part of the instruction is. So the next thing we need to do is create a new instance of StoryBrain in the viewcontroller.swift. So go back to the viewcontroller.swift to be able to tap into the newfound capabilities of the StoryBrain and call it lowercase StoryBrain. So again, we're creating an instance, a variable instance called StoryBrain, and making it be equal to the struct called StoryBrain with uppercase, starting with an uppercase S. And that means what happens is that we can access everything within this struct. So once we have an instance, then the instance will have a story number. It will have stories. That's why we can have a current story with a choice 1. Anyway, and then we can also access the method inside this struct. So the next thing we have to do is call the actual function from this choice made. So we have to go and call the StoryBrain method called nextStory. So from here, the way we do that is we access this variable, this instance of StoryBrain. So we just call it StoryBrain dot, we're calling the method. And so then it's asking us, okay, so we know you want to use the parameter user choice as the name of it. And so what string do you actually want to use? And so in this case, we're going to use the sender dot current title. And that should do it in terms of, oh, here, yeah, right. But it's an optional string. I remember we were looking at that definition. We saw it was an optional string. So we can force unwrap because we know that it's not going to have a nil. Okay, so that's that.
Actually,
and the other thing we want to do is deal with that restart button. So we call the update UI like we did before, and we want restart button to be to have it be hidden equal false. So we know that what's going to happen is we're going to call this function, this method. It's going to go over here. It's going to change the value. So it's going to change it to the last value, which is, it's either going to be 1 or 2. And then it's going to return back to the function or the method that we were just in. So it's going to say, okay, so I did that step for you. I changed the value. And so now we know that the value is the number 1. So we know that we should be displaying the first option. So in this case, it's going to be, we should now see, you see a tiger, shout for help, play dead, or you find a treasure chest, open it, check for traps. So we're really at the end of this very boring game. And so then we need to update the UI, and we need to show the restart button. So we're going to call update UI. And when we do that, I'm sorry, we're going to call update UI, which will hide the restart button. And then we got to re-show it because we know that we are at the end of the story. So that's basically what has to happen in this choice made IB action function. So the next thing we need to do is to figure out what's going to happen when the restart game button is pressed. And so we need to set the StoryBrain story number. So again, that's accessing a parameter inside the StoryBrain instance. of StoryBrain. And we're setting that to be 0, and then we're going to update the UI, and we should see that the value changes. So let's test it right now. So we can see that the restart button is no longer hidden. So when I press it, it should bring back. What happens then is it calls update UI with the story number equals 0. So then it starts at the beginning again. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is this last piece, which I moved over into the StoryBrain, where it says use the StoryBrain to provide the story title and choice text. And that makes a lot of sense because we don't need the view controller, the controller piece, to know what the value is. What we really should, instead of just directly retrieving it from here, we need to go ask the StoryBrain, which is supposed to hold all the information, what it is. So we need to set up some methods in here that are things like get story title. And with this, we have to return a value because remember, we're asking for something. Oops. So we're going to ask for a string back. And then we're going to return. We're just going to immediately return because this structure knows everything about itself. And so then we have to return stories of the current story number. Title. And then we have to create another function that's called get choice 1. And have that return also a string. And now we're going to return stories, story number, choice 1. And then we're just going to do the same thing for choice 2. So now we have this functionality where we can just call these functions and get something back. So let's go over here. So we can replace basically all of this with different things. So we'll keep the same thing of story label.txt because we're basically telling the controller is supposed to control the UI, user interface. So we'll change this to just be story. We're calling that instance of StoryBrain. And we're going to get story title. And then, let's see. And in this case, we're just going to change all of this because we still have to keep this type of a call as we figured out before. But instead of directly calling the story number choice 1, we're going to request from our instance StoryBrain to get choice 1. And we're going to do the same thing here. So I think that'll all work. Let's see. I don't see any obvious errors. So let's try and run it. Oops. Okay, go ahead and stop that and run the new instance. Okay, so that works. And then I'm going to restart it. That works. And since I'm doing this a second time, I can give you a heads up that there's a defect here that I cover in the 5-2 video that's about 10 minutes long. It shows you how to troubleshoot this problem. So this is the very first item that comes up, and I say take a left. And then it's choosing the second one actually causes number, let me see, let me show you. It causes this thing to show. So it's, for some reason, and I'll explain that in the section 5.2 where I show you how to troubleshoot this problem, there's a defect in the code. So anyway, I think this is, we did everything that we were supposed to do. So we did this, move the story progression functionality. We use the story brain to determine which story to show when the user makes a choice with this next story part. And then we use the story brain to provide the story title and choice text to view controller. So I think that that's it. So I'm going to pre-watch this video to make sure it's okay. And then I'll post it for your use. And I hope to see you on Monday. Thanks. Bye-bye.